Good morning, friends. I am Sachin Ketkar. I teach English at the MS University of Baroda, and today we are going to talk about appreciation of poetry. The title of this presentation is The Dance of Language, Appreciating Poetry. And what I'm going to do basically is I'm going to talk about what poetry is, what is it made up of, and how does it work. The presentation will end with a kind of tips and suggestions about how to read a poem. And I will be actually discussing two poems. One is a very famous poem by William Wordsworth titled "A Slumbered in My Spirit Seal," and other one is more recent, a newer poem by a well-known American poet called Mark Strand. And the title of the poem is Eating Poetry. So what we are going to do today is basically we are looking at how poetry is the way language dances and how poetry is to be eaten. So let's have a look at this topic. Friends, in the broadest sense, poetry or literature is art of using language. And when I say art, philosophically speaking, art would mean the ways in which we expand and diversify the ways of seeing and ways of being in this world. It's a very abstract notion, so let's keep it aside for a moment. If you look around us, poetry is everywhere. Though in our classrooms, poetry is not very popular, poetry is actually everywhere. If you look at our film songs, if you look at our religious literature, if you look at our devotional songs, if you look at our film songs, if you look at songs when the television serial starts, if you look at advertisement jingles, if you look at lullabies, if you look at folk songs, if you look at garba, everywhere it's poetry that is around us. Poetry surrounds us, and that is the reason why we study it carefully. It's very important to understand poetry if you want to understand our culture, or any culture for that matter. So let's start looking at poetry. The intention of this discussion is that we are going to understand the ways in which poetry works, and the ways in which poetry dances, and the ways in which poetry can be read. So let's have a look at the slideshow and small slide presentation that I have brought along. So let's have a look. I'm going to use two ideas before we start discussing poetry. First is the etymological definition of poetry. The word poetry is taken from the Greek poetica, which is derived from the word poenin, which means to make. Hence, poetry is something that is made, constructed, artificial. And the ways in which a poem is made are called poetic devices. Poetry is something that is made. This whole idea of poet as a maker is something that we should keep in mind when we look at poems. So this is the first idea, that poem is something which is made. Let's look at another idea which I am going to use in my presentation. This insight, a very powerful insight into poetry, comes from a well-known French poet named Paul Valéry. He makes a very useful and important distinction between prose and poetry. He says, poetry is to prose as dancing is to walking. This is a very interesting phrase that he uses. Poetry is to prose as dancing is to walking. He says in his lecture called Poetry and Abstract Thought, 1939, a lecture given at Oxford. So what does it mean? What does Valéry mean when he says that poetry as dance? Valéry means that prose, and discursive prose in particular, is largely about conveying message or information, and hence it's goal directed. When we say prose is like walking, it means that it has to reach from point A to B or D. It is linear in direction. It has got a straight direction. So prose usually moves in straight direction from point A to point B, and the whole idea behind prose is to reach a particular point in space and in time. On the contrary, poetry is not about going anywhere. Poetry is not basically about giving information or conveying some message. Poetry is not goal directed like prose. It does not have a fixed location to reach. It has got no station to reach. It may start from point C and go to E and come back to A, right? Non-linearly, like a dancer. Dancer goes around in circles. The way dancer occupies the stage is the way language occupies the stage in poetry. The use of language which has these twists and turns are called tropes or figures of speech. The word trope literally means twist and turns. So poetry is made up of these twists and turns, and that is why it dances. So how does a poem dance? Poem dance because it uses turns, twists, and tropes. So these are the two insights that I'm going to use in my analysis of poetry. I think these are very useful distinctions to make. Hence, in today's presentation, we will discuss what is poetry made of and how it dances. Let's look at this poem in greater detail. We'll look at this as a poem that is to be analyzed in our present discussion. This is a very famous poem by William Wordsworth, and the title is the first line of the poem, "A slumber did my spirit seal." And I suggest, if your friends, if you are having your notebooks with you, you can copy this two stanza poem in your notebooks, because we are going to use it extensively for our discussion. The poem is something like this: "A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees. Rolled around in earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees." So this is a two stanza poem, a very famous poem by Wordsworth, and we are going to look at this poem in detail for our analysis. What is the first thing that you have to keep in mind when you come across an unseen poem? For many of you, this poem might be unseen. You might be looking at this poem for the first time. So when you encounter a new poem, then some things that you have to keep in mind, that though a poem is formally distinguished from narrative or a story, each poem consists of a story in it. A poem also has got a plot, like a story has a plot. So every poem has a plot in it. Second very important thing that you have to keep in mind, that though our poetry is formally distinguished from fiction, all poems consist of some fiction. That is, there are a lot of imaginary things that have gone into making of a poem. So poem, though it is separated from fiction and from story, it consists of both fiction and story. So each poem has got an element of narrative, a story that is, and an element of fiction. So in our colleges, when we differentiate between poetry, fiction, and drama, we forget that in poetry you have all these things. Poetry, fiction, and drama are there in a single poem. So that's what it makes it interesting. So when we start reading it, you have to first try to find out what is the plot or narrative of this story. So let's look at this slide here. Very often, the speaker in the poem is one of the characters in the story which a poem tells. So if you look at this poem once again, there is a speaker in this poem, and it's a very important thing to distinguish or differentiate between a speaker in the poem and actual poet. And the reason is because a poem is also a fictional construct. The speaker in the poem may or may not be same as the poet. So when we write answers in exams, it's very important that we don't use words like a poet says this, a poet says that. Instead of that, we should use words like the speaker in the poem says this and the speaker in the poem says that. So that's one of the reasons why we should use this phrase, the speaker. Another term for speaker is also called persona. Persona is what is meant by mask. The speaker of the lines of the poem is commonly mistaken for the poet as a real person. In fact, the speaker in the poem can be very often be a mask or a fictional character or a voice, and this character which is speaking in a poem is called persona. Hence, it's a very good idea of not using the poet says approach while discussing poetry and literature. In the Wordsworth poem we have seen, the story is about a lover who believes that he was asleep when he thought his beloved was not mortal and hence earthly, but wakes up to find her dead and one with nature. The story of this spiritual awakening and the shock and the grief of this awakening is crucial for comprehension and understanding of this poem. So what is the story of this poem? The story of this poem, I'm going back to poem once again, is that the speaker believes that his beloved is not touched by nature or is not touched by earthly years. Let's look at the poem once again because I'm going to keep it in front of you. In the first stanza, the speaker says that his beloved is not touched. He thinks that his beloved is not touched by earthly years. She is above mortality and death, and he had no human fears. But in second stanza, the speaker has all of a sudden woken up to find that his beloved no longer lives, but has become part of the nature. In fact, when she is buried, she has become part of the earth, and she does not have her own motion, her own force. She cannot hear, she cannot see, but she is rolled around in earth's diurnal course. The word diurnal means daily rotation of earth. So she is rolled around in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. So from first stanza is a speaker who is unaware of his beloved's mortality. Second stanza, the speaker becomes aware, and this is a kind of spiritual awakening that takes place. Let's look at the formal organization of this poem. I'm going to keep this slide in front of you for a while. Look at this poem. You will see that it's divided into two parts. Prose, when it is divided into parts, it's called paragraph. But when a poem is divided into parts, it's called stanza. So 4 lines here, first 4 lines and second 4 lines are 2 stanzas in the poem. Most of the traditional poetry is written in meters and rhymes. If you look at words like fears, years, seal, feel, force, course, seas, trees, these words are called rhymes because they are similar in sound. The last syllable of this word is similar in sound. And the arrangement of this rhyme is called rhyme scheme of a poem. If you look at the scheme of this poem in terms of rhyme, then you will see that seal rhymes with feel, force rhymes with course, fears rhymes with years. So seal, feel, fear, years. So you can say it is AB, AB, where seal, eel is A sound, years is B sound. Seal, A, fears, B, feel, A, years, B. Force rhymes with course. So you can say it's rhyme number C. Seas is rhyme number D. So CD, CD. AB, AB, CD, CD is the rhyme scheme of this poem. It's very important to keep these things in mind. If you look at this poem more closely, then you will see that the poem is made up of a fixed number of syllables. Each line of the poem is approximately of same size when it comes to syllables. Now, what is a syllable? Syllable is that part of a word which is pronounced distinctly. For example, word slumber has got 2 syllables, slum and ber. Spirit has got 2 syllables, spi and rit. Human has got 2 syllables, you and man, right? I has got 1 syllable. So each word is made up of either 1 syllable or more than 1 syllable. So each line, if you count, then you will find that there are approximately 8 syllables in each line. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. So first line is of 8 syllables, second line is of 6 syllables. So if you see that there is a pattern, there is certain quantity of syllables that the poet seems to have counted the number of syllables when he wrote the lines. If you look at the first line and the lines closely, then certain syllables which are underlined in front of you are stressed syllables. A slumber did my spirit seal. Sl, sp, s are stressed syllable, and others are unstressed. So in a line there are unstressed syllables and stressed syllables, and there is a regularity here. If you look at line number 3, she seemed a thing that could not feel, also has got 3 syllables. Seemed a thing could not feel. No motion has she, no now no force, rolled round in earth's diurnal course. So alternate lines in this poem has got fixed number of stressed and unstressed syllable. So this organization of stressed and unstressed syllable, the fixed pattern that it follows, is called the meter of the poem. Meter, if you are aware of the word, is something with which we measure something. 1 meter cloth or 1 foot cloth. So you use words like meter and foot to measure the length of something. So what we are doing here, we are using these as units. Just like we use word meter in while buying clothes, we are using word meter here to measure the units of syllables in a line. The smallest unit in a line is called a feet. A slumber did my spirit seal. So a slum is got 1 feet, stress, unstress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress. So you can see that these are